Call of Cthulhu, Prisoner of Ice. I don't even recall seeing this one come out in 1995. I mean, I saw Shadow of the Comet in stores around that time, but I don't think I ever recall seeing Prisoner of Ice. And, you know, I think that might have been part of why I wasn't fully aware of it. Now, like I said, this came out in 1995. And it was inspired a bit by Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. And this is due to a little fact that they had gone to it's set during World War II. And there has always been talk that Adolf was into the occult. And it's also been talked that he had special divisions working on black magic and the occult. So it wouldn't be too hard to believe that he'd go after something Lovecraftian. I mean, heck, that's part of the storyline in Hellboy, I think. Now, you play in this game a protagonist named, no, just known as Lieutenant Ryan. And, in a true Lovecraftian fashion, his past is mysterious, and he's dealing with these eldritch horrors. And as the story continues, you will eventually meet in with a professor who is Parker from Shadow of the Comet. In fact, he's had a daughter by this time who's old enough to help in the war effort, or at least help with with the research that he does now, because he's been looking into the eldritch things. And when you eventually meet up with him in the game, he tells you about the events in the first game, in Shadow of the Comet. And I think the one antagonist from the first game comes back in this game, or they somehow have access to him, because they're messing about with time travel. That's another thing that gets thrown in here. And I definitely don't think that was ever a topic that, a topic that Lovecraft would ever venture into. Anyhow, as they work their way through, as you work your way through it, you also discover that your protagonist, Lieutenant Ryan, he's actually from the future, a very grim future. Humanity is dying out. And it wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't so, how shall I say it, imminent. I mean, when you're talking from in the future, how we tend to, how the politicians look at things, they tend to look in short term. More conservative ones tend to look at short term and not care about the long term, because what'll it matter to me? I'll be dead by then. Stuff like that. So, but I mean, if we think future, we usually think hundreds of years in the future. No, this is decades in the future, not hundreds of years in the future, just decades. And yes, it's very possible that most of the characters are going to be dead by then in the game, but I mean, we're looking at, look at us in this time, and actually, we're probably close to the year that the events are to go majorly downhill. Of course, if you're talking about the 1930s, long in the future would be about now. Yeah, but he got his name Ryan because the only part of his name that came back with him as a child or was Aryan. And that's a bit depressing when you think about it. And the story is pretty good because when you play the game, I mean, when you look at the story, it's a very self-contained, very the story I think is pretty good. Um, Division of the military trying to fight the Eldritch horrors. We got a mysterious member who's a good part for the team. Turns out, oh well, he's from the future, so that's why he's so good for the team. He's seen these Eldritch horrors. He don't necessarily remember them because he was so young when he was sent back, but there's trying to stop this. Of course, it's a little bit of a disappointment when you go to the future and to a part that's nearly destroyed and you find out that, well, these forces ravaged the earth. Humanity is dying off. So you were sent back in time to try and prevent this, I guess. And that's one of the beautiful things. This is like it features time travel literally almost done right. Because you have the quote grandfather paradox in there and everything. And at the end, you can actually make a choice. And the only difference in the choice is whether your character returns to the time that he's been in, or because he's trying to stop the things, he doesn't return. And what it boils down to is nothing he does is going to really have an effect. Possibly the only way he'd be able to do something is if he decided to break the time loop. But you don't necessarily know if returning is to the time he would like. If he goes back to his time and then returns, or goes back to his time and stays there, you don't know which one is the better option. And in the end, it's the final thing because there was it was World War II at the time, so it was the Nazis. One agent does go back in time and is able to set things in motion for the people to worship the Eldritch horrors. So it doesn't matter what you've done, they're there. So in this respect, it does tend to go with the Eldritch horror, the kind of cosmic horror that Lovecraft got known for. So, story-wise, I can praise it. I can praise the underlying story. What I can't praise was the style they used. Now, all your characters, that you interact with, that you talk with, the creatures, they were all done with what looks like 3D models, early 3D models. This is at the time where you're talking like early 3D animation. Now, this is from the same company that released prior Alone in the Dark. But these 3D models looked better than those 3D models. But the whole settings are still the hand-drawn. And I think that causes a greater, more staggering difference, which is a bit of a negative, a major negative, because it just looks so out of place. And they were also just, it was also when more games were starting to go to the 3D environment running on discs like CD-ROMs. So either running on CD-ROMs or installing from them. And I think that's what really hurt this. Like I say, the story is great, but the graphics, it's just a slap in the face. I mean, the charm to the original Alone in the Dark trilogy was, well, it was a hand-drawn type of scenario. You had a 3D figure that, while it didn't look realistic, it fit well with the primitive look. In this case, it doesn't fit well. And I think it's just because that it was in that weird time when you either should go all in or keep with the old ways. This was a very nasty juxtaposition, really nasty contrast, in my opinion. I mean, you could tell who your moving figures were very easily, but you couldn't. It just didn't look right, in my opinion. I mean, even if they had to interact with something, it didn't necessarily look right. And that's a big negative. A very big negative in my book. I think of all these games I've played, I could say that this one leaves me with a bad taste in the mouth, so to speak. Like I said, the story is great in this one. It's a great story. It really does flow nicely with the Lovecraftian tones. But of course, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next time around, because I think the next retrospective I'm going to be basically combining these two, this and Shadow of the Comet together, talking about it more or less as a whole unit, even though this story can be considered a separate unit, and possibly they didn't have to tie it to Shadow of the Comet, but they did. So I'm going to discuss them both together. The pluses of these two games together, and the negatives. and how they sort of, counterbalance out each other and talk about the whole series, those two games. Because in essence, this was separate from all the other games that I have in my library that have Call of Cthulhu in the name. But that's for the next time. As always, this is Rich Kale here on YouTube, Rich Gen X elsewhere. If you've listened to the end, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And you can check out the playthrough of this game on my channel. Probably one of the shorter ones for any game with Call of Cthulhu in the name. And you can check out some of the other stuff I have up on the channel. Until next time, take care and have fun.